Hello and welcome to my demo and overview of this personal project of mine called Too Long Didn't Play. This is obviously a play on the very common acronym Too Long Didn't Read, and you'll see why in a moment. So I was motivated to build this application because I work full time, but I still love playing video games, but sometimes I just can't commit to those 50 to 100 hour experiences that are involved with the newest, latest and greatest games such as Red Dead Redemption, Elden Ring, and whatnot. So there are game search engines out there, but they typically don't let you filter by playtime. So maybe I just want a nice 10-hour package, right? So that's why I've built this application to let you focus in on how long you want to play a game for, but also provide you some other filters as well so you can really tailor the search results to the exact experience that you're looking for. Again, we'll just go through a quick demo, but later on we'll go through an overview of the components I used to build this app, that including the database, API endpoints, servlets, and the UI. So here we go. It's a one-page application. At the moment, it's just your filter form, your search form here. From top to bottom, we have our result size. That's just going to let you specify exactly how many games you want to explore through, how many you want to show up in your resulting list. Here's your playtime. So this is where you can specify exactly how many hours on average you want to take to complete a game. So each game has an average playtime associated to it, and that's what you'll be basically searching for here. With our next filter, our playtime leniency, this is where you can be a little bit flexible, give a little leeway to exactly how many hours you want to play. So for example, if I want to search for, let's say 10 games, or I want to explore through 10 games that take around 10 hours to beat on average to get the full experience. But I'll give 2 hours of leeway, so anywhere from 8 to 12 hours is a game that I'm looking for. Now, before I get into the second half of the filters here, let's go ahead and just run this search and see what we find. We're automatically scrolled down here. We're given a list of 10 games in this nice tile formation, and you can see as I hover over each of the games, they blow up a little bit, and that basically lets you know that you can click on it for some additional information. We've got a really great list of games here. As you can see, playtime 8 hours, 8 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, 11 hours, 11 hours, 9 hours, Batman Arkham City, 9 hours. Really great collection here. You can also get some additional information as well, what platforms they're on, their Metascore, and when they were released. And these can all be tailored as well in the filters that you will see in just a minute. But let's go ahead and click on one of these games so we get the additional description, take a closer look at the image that is associated to it. Got a lot of great options here. Obviously, a lot of these are pretty well known. Let's take a look at Batman Arkham City. So we've popped up this modal box here. We get the same information as before, but now we also get a little description box. And this is where you can read through exactly what the game is about, how these publishers want to sell it to you, and whether or not it's something you might want to download for yourself and actually play through. So let's go back. We'll reset a little bit, and let's take a look at some of these other filters here. So let's say maybe I'm specifically looking for an RPG shooter. Go ahead and find games. Now we've only got a list of 6 games here, so that's basically you've put in the filters that have really narrowed down the list here, and this is an extremely, extremely tailored list of games that are going to really fit the qualifications that you've asked for. These are all RPG shooters that have play times between 8 and 12 hours, and so we've got 6 perfect items matching those qualifications. These are great games. I love them, but I've played them. But Outer Worlds, I have not played yet, so let's go ahead and click on it. I really love these background images that I've sourced, and I'll go into detail about where I've sourced them from later. Let's reset again here. Let's deselect these genres. So let's go ahead and just look at some platforms here. Let's look at an interesting platform. Let's take a look at the PSP. That was a great little console that I had when I was younger. Let's see what games that I get popped up here. So we're looking for between 8 and 12 hours. Let's expand this a little bit. Let's make this we'll set this to 15, and we'll be pretty generous here and give this a 10-hour leeway. Okay, great. Yeah, we've got some awesome games here. I have added code that encourages the search to randomize the list even if you press find games without changing any of the filters, just so that it gives you that sense of, exploring continuously through games that fit your qualifications. But of course, the more specific you get with those qualifications, with those filters, the same games are going to appear. All right, so we've taken a look at the platforms, and you can select multiple platforms as well. You can select multiple genres, but let's actually go ahead. We'll remove our platform filter. And let's get into the last filter here. It's actually one of my favorite. I find it the most interesting. You can specify the amount of time you want to play, but maybe you're looking for an older experience. So like for me, there's a lot of games that I saw growing up that I was just too young to play and couldn't really understand them or maybe get the full experience out of them just because I was too naive. But maybe I'm ready for that now. So let's open up this drop down, and to select the game age, you're not selecting the actual years, you're selecting the word associated to those years. The way I've set this up is a new game is within the last year, modern is from 1 to 5 years, nostalgic is 5 to 15, vintage 15 to 25, and antique anything older than 25. Now, to some people, a vintage game may not be a game that happened in the mid to early 2000s. Maybe a vintage game is in the 90s, etc., etc. That can always be tweaked based off any feedback that I get. But let's say, I'm looking for a game that's nostalgic, something that maybe I was very young when it came out, but something that I want to revisit. So we've got a great list here, and the nostalgic, you do get your later 2010s, not quite your 2020s, but you also get your games like, let's see, so we got some 2016, 2014, 2009, Killzone 2. I remember when that came out. Obviously, I was too young to play that at that point, but something I'd definitely like to revisit here. Let's go back one more, and let's go vintage. Let's go to our mid-2000s games. We got some great ones, obviously Counter-Strike Source, Command & Conquer, Call of Duty World at War, obviously very iconic, very popular. A lot of Sims, some really cool games here. And you can see we've got some 2000 games, 2006, 2004, 02, 08. Let's go back one more. Let's go back to our antique games, and we'll pull out some really old ones here. Now we're right in the 90s, 97, 96, 93. Let's see, what's our oldest one here? 92 looks like it's our oldest one with Sonic the Hedgehog. So really, the great thing about this application is that it's kind of fun to just explore these different games, bring you back in time, find the games that aren't going to break the bank in terms of your time. And I have a lot of fun just putting in different filters and seeing what pops up. I found a lot of great games that I'd love to try out. Like I mentioned earlier, Outer Worlds is definitely one that I think I'm going to pick up at some point. So yeah, just a great little simple but powerful application. And my whole goal with this was, in terms of personal growth and personal development was, obviously we'll get into an overview of the coding in just a minute here, but the main mission was just for me to have this idea and to create something and actually complete it. And so I'm very happy and proud that I did. As we touched on the coding parts, there's going to be a lot of areas that could use improvement, be done a little bit better, but just the fact that I've been able to take those puzzle pieces and fit them together to get this result, I'm really happy about, and I think it's a truly useful item that I'm going to be using. So now that we've gone through the demo, let's actually take a look at the code and the implementation, because there's some really interesting bits there. Okay, so welcome to the second part of this YouTube video where I start going through all the different components involved in creating this application, starting with part 1, which is the TLDP-database. That's how you'll see it in my GitHub, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the database that I've created to source these games from. There's a lot of great resources out there for actually directly getting game records from existing video game databases. But after doing some research, none of them just quite fit the bill for what I wanted to do, specifically with being able to filter by average playtime. But one that I just wanted to give a shout out to and give some credit to was the Raj database here, which I have on screen right now. It's a really cool web page, really fun to explore. They've got over 800,000 games in their database, which is just mind-blowing. They have a really powerful and easy-to-use API that I could have used in some way to source my games directly from, but again, it would have just been very tricky and a bit inefficient, and I really wanted to improve my skills and sort of test myself, so I used the API to source the games to insert into my own formatted database, but I didn't use it directly. So I wanted to give them a shout out. Really cool company, really cool application. And again, they've got this great page here for exploring their API, which is exactly what I used. I got an API key and basically lived in this documentation for a couple hours. So let's go ahead and start talking about the TLDP-database. Now this is entirely written in Python. It just made the most sense for what I wanted to do. It was very friendly in terms of setting up connections to the database and inserting these records and making calls to the API. So let's start talking about these different classes. So here I have my config file. This is just defining a couple different important URLs, keys, and pathways. We can see our API URL, our API key, and the home directory of our database. I call the database game filter, and we'll see that in a minute. Now, obviously, these are environmental properties, not something I wanted to include in GitHub source control, so they're abstracted away, hidden away, but we're still calling them here, just from my .env file, which is away from prying eyes for some security. So now let's take a look at the DTO. This is my main data transfer object. So this is what I'm taking the data from the Raj database using their API. I'm extracting their data and I'm fitting it into this DTO. So we have this main object here, our game object, and it's got all of our different properties that we want to use in our database, but there's some more complex properties that are actually going to require individual tables for. There's not just one main games table, there's actually also a genre and platforms table as well, and because they're a little bit more complicated to format, they get their own object that we see up here, and they've got their own properties, and they're all connected by game IDs, thanks to Raj API for having a specific ID for each game. Obviously made things a bit easier for me. But so this is how it's set up. Pretty easy to put together once I sort of understood exactly how I wanted the data to look and bring it over into my database. And this obviously makes it really easy to make changes later on and not have to mess around too much with SQL or anything like that. So let's move ahead and go to this is our database handler. This just has all the methods required for setting up the database and inserting into the database. We've got our create table, and that's called multiple times. We have 3 different tables in our database: games, genres, and platforms. Here I'm providing their schemas as well as their names, and we'll see what those look like in just a bit. I also have an errors table to put in any sort of transaction errors that occur. But so far, after running this multiple times, I've actually not received any errors, which is a good sign. And then we have this main function here that's going to create all those different tables for us. We have a delete table method, and then this is going to be our main insertion method. So we're passing in our games that we can then go ahead and use our execute many method to insert that data into the specific tables that we want within the game filter database. So some of these properties, data within these DTOs are a little bit complicated, so I'm doing some looping in here based off of what's how the data comes in from the API and how I put it into my DTO. Requires these nested for loops here. So let's go ahead and take a look at our API handler. Now the way that I performed this process of requesting data and inserting it into the database efficiently is I used that sort of hybrid methodology of batch and transactions. So as you can see here, I'm taking in the batch size, which is going to basically define how many items I want to insert at once. And this is actually it's really nice because the Raj API takes in a result size parameter, so I can actually just pass this batch size value into that result size API request parameter, and I'll get, so for example, if my batch size is 100, I'll get 100 games from the API call, and those 100 games will be inserted. And then basically with the transaction number, that'll define how many times do I want to do that. So if we go over to this game filter, this is just my main method here. We can see I do 100 times 100. So we do 100 games with 100 transactions. And now this doesn't actually equate. It seems like there's a limit with the API of about 4,000 games. So that's exactly what my database comes out to, is 4,000 games, which is plenty. So I am a little limited by that, but still plenty of games to search through and filter for. One thing I want to mention about this DTO is that I originally was not including descriptions for video games, but it seemed like something that I had to do for when you click on the game in the application, you really need to see something else besides what you've already saw on the main tile page. The description really impacts the performance of this whole procedure here, but I think it was worthwhile because it makes the application have so much more depth. So, but initially this was very, very quick in terms of creating the database. Obviously, it slowed down a little bit from that description. So let's go back to our API handler here. We've got our parameters that we're going to pass with our API request. We've got our database manager that we're creating. We're giving it the path of our database. We set up the database with all our tables, and then here's where we start looping through our calls to the API with a specific number of transactions. We get our response. We're checking if there's an error. We're going to convert that response to JSON, and then we're going to pass that JSON to my DTO, and that's going to turn it into this game object that I can then perform the batch transaction on and insert it into my database. Then I go to the next URL, and that's it. And we do that until we're done. So that's it for this project. Obviously, I include a lot of commentation to explain exactly what I'm doing, so feel free to read through that to sort of see my logic behind some of the coding that I'm doing. But let's take a look now at our actual database. Open it up, and you can see it comes out to around 7,000 kilobytes, 8,000 kilobytes. So here we have our errors table. Again, it's not actually filled with anything at the moment. We never really got an error with the procedures that I was running. But here we have our games database. We have our ID, the slug, name, Metacritic, playtime, description, background image. So this is those background images that I showed you before in the application in the demo. That's actually provided by Raj. So again, huge shout out to them because those images are really, really cool. And so let's take a look at the data here. Let it load in. So you see we have 4,000 items here. We can scroll through these, plenty of items to go through. So now the way I've set this up, again, so that the genres and the platforms associated to each game are not in the main games table. And that's because those genres and platforms, that data came in an array, and it would just be too much to have to sort of figure out if I were to put it into this table, because not every game has, a game might have one genre, or it might have five. It might have one platform, it might have five. So the easiest way to do it was to create these two tables, and they're both structured basically the same, where you have your ID, the genre ID, and the name of the genre. And that ID, that's related, so that's the actual game ID, and we can see that here in our games table, our ID right there, and that's going to be the same for our platforms table as well. So this is the database. This is now, I have this locally on my computer, and this is what I'm reading from within the main application itself. So let's jump over now to my other VS Code project, which will go over all of the sort of Java that I've performed, the API integration, the database manager on that end, the servlet aspect of it. But then I actually ported that over to Eclipse because I wanted to use Eclipse integrated server environment. So, but let's begin talking about that aspect. And this is the main backend. This is the heart of the application. And it's written all in Java. I use a variety of reference libraries. Now, in this process, I learned about Maven and Gradle. However, I stuck to just sort of downloading the jar files and connecting them to my project without Maven and Gradle. Moving forward, however, I will most likely use those build utilities. But for now, stuck the jar files in there. So here's some of the reference libraries I used down here in the bottom left. The JavaX servlet, JSON, JUnit for testing, Mockito, which I didn't end up needing. Mockito I did end up using for in my testing, as well as SQLite for connecting to the database. So let's go ahead and jump into these classes here. You'll see that I've set it up very similar to the way I did for the database portion of this, at least for the database aspects of this class. Look very similar to the sort of structure of the Python. So you can see I have a database config file, which mainly does the same thing as the first config file that we looked at, which was just connect, we have the path to the database. Instead of an environment file, I've hidden that URL in a config.properties. And let's go ahead and look at game.java, which is sort of my DTO for this portion of the project. And it's very similar, but again, it's tailored specifically for, rather than grabbing JSON from the Raj API, we're now grabbing record sets, I believe, or records from the database, and we need to convert that to JSON. So that they're structured to be able to allow that to be done very flexibly and easily. So you can see everything we want to display here is provided as a property of this game class. You can see we have a constructor, some getters and setters, and then this handy dandy toJSON function, which I wrote to convert this object to JSON, so that we could then pass it in our response, in our API response. So we'll see this game object used in a little bit. Let's take a look at query parameters. So this is a class that I used just to help with defining the structure of the parameters that are coming in from the API, that are being given in the API request. And that way I can sort of format those different parameters to be easily read by my database manager, which is in charge of handling the specific queries that need to be run. So if we look at the query parameters, they'll line up with sort of the different filters and inputs that we saw in the demo application. I'm using an enum to define the age. We have new, modern, nostalgic, vintage, antique, and none. We've got a couple helpful, or one helpful static method here. Result, playtime, the leniency, genres list, platform list. And then from here, it's pretty typical stuff. We have an empty constructor, some getters and setters. We do have to do some manipulation of the lists just based on how they are coming through in the request. So we're taking that genre list, adding some quotes to it, and we have to do some splitting between, it comes in as a string, so we just have to split them, turn it into a list, and then add some quotes. And then very similar for the platform list as well, and then we have a setter here for the age. So not too much to, not a very complicated class, but I think having this class helped out a lot. Same with having game.java, both just acting as intermediary objects allowed for very flexible changes, because I had to go back and edit some things, make some additional functionalities, and having these put in place made it very easy to make those future changes, not have to sort of dig deep into messy code. It just sort of, the encapsulation here was very nice in making coding more efficient. So let's take a look at the game API service now. We can see we have our web server set up. However, I did not run the class on a server through VS Code. I ended up porting the code to Eclipse to use its integrated server environment. But I was prepared to set it up here, so we do have some leftover web servlet stuff, and that just made it easy to just, I copied and pasted that over to Eclipse without too many changes needed. So here we have, this is our servlet, it's our API service, and we have a do get method. We're not doing any posts, not doing any patches. This is purely a get API as defined by our game.json here. This is just the Open API endpoint that I wrote, and we'll touch on that right after I get to this game API service class. So it takes in a request and response. We're seeing this method here, which validates the parameters, which basically just takes the parameters from the request, turns it into a query parameter object based on, do certain things exist in the request, do they not exist. The result size and the playtime are both required parameters, and those input boxes require you to fill them in, otherwise you'll get a notification. So you can see I'm handling bad parameters, returning responses, bad requests and whatnot. That's all handled here, and I'll send back a specific response for bad requests as well as for internal server errors, and those are both defined in the Open API specification I've created as well. But if all goes according to plan, then we've got our print writer, we've got our JSON object ready to fit our results in it, and that's when we call our database manager, which is, if successful, we can set that status, we can set the code, and then we can print it out and return. So if we go ahead and head over to the database manager, we can see here we have our method getGames, which is going to return a JSON object. And this is just sort of an overarching method. It doesn't really have too much going on in it. It's just basically setting it up and calling the necessary methods that have most of the meat and doing the hard work. But you can see it will eventually, once it gets the data in this result set, it'll call this finalize JSON object method, which we'll jump to right now. And this is going to, initially I created it to just convert the result set to a JSON object. However, I did have to add some additional functionality here where I have to call this get platforms for game. And that's going to go ahead and also perform a query to the platforms table to fill in that information to be presented within the application. It would have been too messy to try and put that in the SQL. It would have made it very unwieldy and hard to work with. So, once the result set is given, you're not getting the platforms for every single game in the database. Depending on the result size, you may just be getting the platforms for 10 to 20 games, so the impact is not too great, and it was a decent place to fit it. And I am handling any edge cases here. If need be, you can see if we can get the platforms of the game, we will. Otherwise, we'll just catch the SQL exception and go along without the platform. So, the user will still get their data for sure. Up here, we have our build statement. This is where we have all of the SQL. Now, this is where, I put it together and it works, and I'm doing the correct handling of issues. You can see I'm checking for null and empty values. However, of course, whenever dealing with SQL in Java, there's always ways to clean it up and make it better. So I'm open to any feedback here. I primarily used string builders. That gave me just a lot of flexibility in terms of editing each aspect individually and then putting them together at the end. As we can see here, I'm appending the join to the select, then the where to the select, and then potentially the group. And then eventually I'll call this build prepared statement, and that's just going to handle setting all those parameters based on how many are needed and the tracked parameter index. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at the game.json. So this is the open API specification that I built. Now, of course, it's not really posted anywhere because I'm not deploying this application, but it was good practice to build it, and I would frequently come back to check on it to help the direction of my code and how I'm handling the request and how I'm handling the response. So you can see it's all defined here. These are the parameters that you can put in, the potential responses you may get, and you can see the bad requests and internal server errors here as well. Finally, the last part of this test, which was very important, the last part of this project, which was very important to me, was the database, the testing, the JUnit testing that I did, and this is where I used Mockito so that I could perform mock servlet requests here. And this is just where I can, test the validity of all of these classes here, make sure they're working without actually having to go back and forth with working with the front end part of the application just to test new functionality. This allowed me to easily go ahead and make changes, make sure they worked, and then move on to the full application. So completely built out, tests every feature as well as edge cases. The database manager test will obviously work with the database manager and is responsible for just testing, making sure that the data that comes back is actually correct. Here we can see some different edge cases. And the game API service test will not really test the validity of the data, whether or not it's correct, because that's already handled by the database manager test. But it's just going to make sure that requests are being sent correctly and that the responses are the expected responses that we want for different parameters. So this was a lot of fun to build this part, and the previous part were what I had most confidence in, but I still learned a lot. It was a great experience. But now let's move on to the final part, which is just the front end portion. Okay, so last but not least, we have the front end portion of the application. I'm just going to go over the JSP file I created, the JavaScript, and the CSS. All of the Java that we just looked at is also in here as well. Again, I just ported over to Eclipse again for that service environment, which was very helpful for running the application. But let's start with the JSP. That's where some items are. So you can see I've set up this form. That's what we saw with all the different inputs for our parameters that we want to send in our request. Now, so I had a certain vision in mind when creating this form. It does look very utilitarian right now, but it works, and I think it looks clean enough. The way it is now with those scrolling lists definitely works for just how many different values there are. But in this area, I'm definitely open to some feedback in terms of making that feel a little bit less utilitarian. I think the rest of it looks very modern and feels very nice. That form box does look a little bit, not quite as fun as I'd like it to, but it's not too bad. And again, it makes sense and was very clean to implement with what I wanted to do with getting those parameters into the request. So that's what I have here. As you can see, we have an onSubmit here, which is going to call a method make request. We're going to pass in the page context path, and we're going to return false. If we come down here past the form, we can see we have our modal here, which that's the box that pops up when we click on our games. That's going to show us the description and whatnot. We have some on-clicks here for closing and whatnot, as well as the ID. Now this is just sort of setting everything up, but most of the actual logic for the front end is of course going to take place in my JavaScript. Now when I was first building this out, I really wanted to use React. However, this application just didn't necessarily call for it, would have overcomplicated things a little bit too much, although I am very for making things complicated if it means learning and pushing my skills. However, just did not seem necessary in the front-end aspect of this, so I used JavaScript here with our tldp.js file, which we will check out right now. So now we're in our tldp JavaScript, and we can see here our top method, which does most of the hard work for us, is our make request method. We called that our JSP file. We're bringing in our context path. The first thing we have to do is get all the values from the elements in our document. Once we've made sure they're not null, then we can go ahead and start putting together that URL. I did have to do some extra sanitization with the genres and platforms, of course, because those can potentially be lists. So that's just going to go ahead and get those values correctly, format them so that they can be attached to our URL, and I'll show that in a minute. Now I am using Ajax to perform the GET request, and upon success, we're going to do some extra work here to set up those different tiles, as well as prepare an event listener to display game details if any of those tiles are clicked. Let's move below this. Again, we're handling if no alerts are found. We're going to animate down to the tiles on success. We're also going to handle, what happens when we get those other specific errors that are defined in the Open API specification. Down here, just got some more logic to help us display the game details in our modal, our close modal method. Then we have our get selected options method, which if we go back up and look, we're going to call that on our genres and platforms here. We're passing in those IDs. That's going to give us our list of different genres that we want to include in the parameter, which we then later append to the URL with this append to URL if not empty method, which we can also see right below it. Again, that's just going to make sure that those lists look correctly and are ready to be joined to that URL. I also performed some capitalization here. It's not perfect as seen in the application, but it just felt better than leaving them not capitalized. So finally, we have our style sheet. This just goes through and adds all the fancy layers and whatnot to make it look pretty. Not much to say here. It's all pretty standard stuff. Got some little fancy elements here to add in those effects and those colors and whatnot. So we're doing some animation, we're doing some hovering, some slide in, some focus, things of that nature. So that is the entirety of TLDP. Thank you for checking this out. This was a very informal way of going through the whole project, going through the overview. I was just very excited to talk about it. So thank you for bearing with me, and if you have any feedback on the project, I'd love to hear about it. I'll be moving on to my next project very soon, but in the meantime, I'll be doing what I can to make sure that this is ready to be presentable and look clean and impressive enough to be on my LinkedIn, to be on my GitHub, to be on my resume.